Hello and welcome to the very first episode of A Stitch in Time. My name is Carol and I'm known as Knits and Pearls on Ravelry. Today is Friday, January 6, 2017, and I'm recording from my home in the Fraser Valley of British Columbia. I live about 100 kilometers or 60 miles east of Vancouver. I'm very excited to be with you today. I have thought about doing a video podcast for a number of years now and decided this was the time. What better time than New Year's, right? So here I am. I don't have any fancy equipment. I'm recording on my iPad, and so hopefully that all goes well. And if this takes off, who knows, maybe I'll invest in some better equipment. But for now, what you see is what you get. After many stops and starts, I've realized that this is not as easy as it looks, and I've decided I just have to press record and go, and just let it flow, because I will never get it perfect. I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am married and have 3 grown children and 3 grandchildren. They all live within about a mile of where I do, so I'm very lucky to have my family close to me. I get to see them quite often. I have been a stitcher of many sorts throughout the years. I think I first learned to knit in brownies. We had to knit a square for one of the badges. But I probably didn't really take it up until my teens, and then have knit off and on over the years. I began to really knit in earnest about 2003 when I started to work at a yarn and needlework shop. I always say that back then I thought I knew how to knit, but when I started working I realized just how much I didn't know. But through my own experience and the experience of helping customers solve their knitting problems, I've learned a lot. I'm a much more experienced knitter now, and when I left that job, I thought perhaps my knitting would wane, but actually it hasn't. I knit pretty well every day. A long time ago, in my late teens and early 20s, I worked in a fabric store, and back then sewing was my passion. I sewed just about everything I wore. But since I left that job when I started having children, and since that time I really don't sew garments very much anymore. I mostly would do things like altering and making curtains and such. And then about a year ago I was inspired to try the Quilt As You Go method by Sarah of the Love Sock Wool podcast. I think many of us were inspired by her work. And I just love it. I decided it was time for a new sewing machine. I'd had my old one since I was in grade 11. And while it was still a very serviceable machine, I bought one that was more friendly for quilting. And I have just had a ball with that. I always liked the idea of putting the patterns together, the fabrics together, but I never liked the idea of dealing with the finished quilt and having to quilt that whole area, and especially the idea of doing it by hand. So this Quilt As You Go method is just perfect. It's instant gratification in doing the little squares, and then it's very exciting to see them all come together. So I've had a lot of fun with that this year. I used to be quite a cross-stitcher. My house is full of cross-stitch pictures that are framed, hung on the wall. I still do it occasionally. I find it a lot harder. My vision is not as good as it used to be, even with glasses and corrective lenses. But I'm still able to do it with good light, and I do have a couple of pictures I really want to get finished to put up in my home. But mostly it's knitting that takes my time and attention. So now that you know a little bit about me, why don't we just jump right in? I thought I would tell you about what I'm wearing. This is the Landscape Cowl by Cecily Glowett MacDonald. I knitted a couple of years ago out of Noro Silk Garden sock. It's color S8, very inventive. This is an eternity or infinity scarf, but I like to wear it wrapped like this, and I get a ton of wear out of it. It's warm, it's easy to wear. I love the bright jewel tones. So that's that. My first, well, I guess it's my first finished object of 2017. I finished all the knitting except the Kitchener stitch on New Year's Eve, and then New Year's morning I got up and finished these socks. I am quite a sock knitter. That's what I knit mostly. This is the Regia Perfect yarn in 7121 Lagoon. I thought these were so fun. For those who don't know, you receive a skein of yarn that has a yellow stretch of yarn preceding each of the pattern repeats. So you begin with the cuff. Once you finish this navy stretch, or whatever color, obviously in the colorway you have, you switch to the other and you can knit it down. The ball band tells you to begin the heel after this stripe. And I chose to do a short row heel on this pair, and then you knit your way down the foot and cast off, you know, when it's the right size. And so you have two socks that are just the same, which I like. Unless I am making them intentionally fraternal, I am very much in the identical sock camp. That's just how I am. I really like how these turned out. I would like to get my hands on another ball of this yarn. I think it's really fun. And as we all know, Regia wears like iron, so they're great. They'll be a good workhorse pair of socks. So of course, when you finish a pair of socks, you need to cast on another. So my first pair that I cast on were from this yarn, which is the Regia Arnie and Carlos. This one is in the colorway 3653 Star Night. Lately, I've been knitting my plain vanilla socks in tandem. I find that the easiest way, just to make sure that they turn out the same. I'll knit the ribbing on one, knit the ribbing on the next, knit a few repeats of pattern on one, repeat it on the next, and so forth. So when I'm done, I have a pair. That really helps to combat the second sock syndrome. And yeah, it's just something I've been doing probably for a good year now, rather than doing one at a time. My usual vanilla sock is 64 stitches on a 2mm needle. I like to knit my legs. If I'm going to do a heel flap and gusset, I'll knit 7 inches and then work the heel flap and gusset. But if I do a short row heel, I'll work the cuff 8 inches and then add that in. Most of the time, I will do what's called a yarn over short row heel right on the spot. But occasionally, I've done a true an afterthought heel. If I want to maintain the stripe sequence or end up with that bullseye that in the heel area, I really like that look. What I will probably do on these is pick out one of these colors, probably either the light gray or possibly this nice hot fuchsia pink, and I'll do a short row heel before continuing the leg on these. So this is just the kind of knitting I do watching TV or riding in the car. I always have a pair of plain socks on the go. It's just the perfect go-with project and mindless. So that's those. But I decided I also needed a pair of socks that was just a little more challenging, because I do like to do that too. So this was my other New Year's cast on. It's the Cup of Tea socks that seem to be making the rounds these days. It is patterned by Robin Lynn, and I'm using Blue Moon Fiber Arts socks that rock lightweight in the Tea and Alchemy colorway. I think that gives it a pretty good indication of color. This is a very simple but interesting pattern. I've worked these up in just a couple of days while also working on other things. So I've been really happy with this pattern and look forward to carrying on. I'm going to do a short row heel in this sock also, I decided. So I'm ready to put that in anytime. That's my next step. There's the ball band in case you're interested. And I'm knitting those on a 2.5 millimeter needle. That's what I knit Blue Moon Fiber Arts because it's more like a sport weight, I would say, than a fingering weight. Another project I've been working on is the Luwan, L-U-W-A-N, by Carol Feller. It is a pullover sweater. There's an idea of what it looks like. Kind of an asymmetrical, or like the back is lower than the front. Worsted weight pullover. I began this as part of the Luwan knit along, but life just got crazy before Christmas, so I wasn't able to complete it. But I do have the body just about done. It's in a beautiful, beautiful red. This is my favorite color. This is also Blue Moon Fiber Arts, and this is called Single Silky Targy in the True Blood Red colorway. I think I have, yeah, I have a ball band here. I've really enjoyed working with this yarn. It's kind of like a felted single, I would say, slightly felted. So similar in feel to a Malabrigo worsted. Beautiful tones in it, as you can see. And you work the front pattern with, it's just divided with a, let's see if I can bring it up to the thing, divided by just a line of garter ridge, but then you work the short row garter ridges, which create the draped back, or the sloped back. So the back will sit quite a bit lower than the front. I'm just about there. I have to do one more section of this, oh, I can't remember what she calls it. It's just a knit one, purl one, seed stitch, kind of a modified seed stitch, because you work a round of plain knitting in between. And then these garter things. So once I've done that, I think about 8 more rows, and then I have to do an inch of garter, and then I can work around the neck and put the sleeves on. So I'm very excited to be finishing this up soon. We have actually had unseasonably cold weather here near Vancouver this year. It's been sub-zero temperatures for several weeks now. The sun is shining today. It's beautiful, but it's still cold out. And I would like to wear this before the winter is out. Normally I don't have much use for a worsted weight long sleeve sweater, but this year I could use it. So I'm anxious to get that done off the needles. I'm hoping within the next couple of weeks to be done with that. So another thing that I picked up, I started this before Christmas also as part of Helen Stewart's Knit Vent. It is the Alpine Sunset Shawl. And again, just ran out of time with Christmas knitting, and then a little disaster before Christmas. I'll get into that. So I've worked quite a bit. I'm about 70% finished now. Helen does this great percentage system where you literally check off each row as you go, and she lets you know along the way how much percent you are finished. So I believe I have another 4 rows of this motif to go, and then I get into the border. So that should net up fairly quickly. The yarn is Knit Picks Stroll Tweed in the North Pole Heather colorway, which I thought was just a perfect choice. It doesn't show up on my screen quite as, oh, that's more like it. It's a little bit of an aqua blue with a little tweedy flecks in it. It's beautiful, and it's so soft. So I'm looking forward to knitting this and wearing it, while it's still cold and wintry outside. So that shouldn't take too long to finish off either. Now, what has been taking my attention up though for the past few days is a project I started a couple of years ago, and I think everyone and their dog has one of these on the go, but it's the sock yarn blanket, mitered square. I, as I said, started this a couple of years ago, and I don't know when I've enjoyed a project this much. Me being, well, you heard I like my socks matched, so it might not come as a surprise that I can't just pick up a random ball of yarn and start knitting on this. I like to plan it out. I decided to alternate solid or semi-solid colors with more variegated colors to help break them up. And my rule is that each square must go with the 4 that surround it. So I want them to be complementary. So that causes some challenges. I can't just pick up a skein and go. I do have to lay them out as I go. But that's part of the fun too. I actually really enjoy that process of pulling the different skeins out from my scrap stash and playing with their location. That's a big part of what I enjoy about this. And I tend to knit across the row, and I'll knit a solid, and then I'll knit a variegated, a solid, a variegated. So I'm really building up 2 rows of squares at a time, but it helps keep my interest because the solid or semi-solid are not quite as interesting as the variegateds to knit up. So it gives me something to look forward to. So as you can see, it's quite large. I'm making it big enough to cover the top of my queen size bed, although it won't necessarily live there. It's just a good size, and I figured out I'm probably about 8 rows of squares away from finishing it. So what I did, which is different than a lot of people, is I decided that I wanted the edges to be straight. So I devised a method of creating a triangle along the sides to square it up. And so I've done that all along each side. I haven't decided yet whether or not I'm going to do the same on the bottom and the top. I might. On the other hand, I do quite like the way the zigzaggy edge looks. I also haven't decided completely how I'm going to finish the edge. I know the original pattern by, I think it's Shelley Kang. Yeah, Shelley Kang. She did an I-cord, which I actually like the look of quite a bit. So that's a distinct possibility. I will probably do it in, like I thought maybe a charcoal gray would be a good neutral to, you know, kind of blend everything together. So we'll see. For the most part, I've been very good about weaving in ends as I go. When I picked it up the other day after months and months of hiatus, I realized I hadn't on the last couple rows. But what I'm doing is, as I'm working my way across the blanket, I'm weaving those in under the square that I'm working on. So it's not having to do it all at once, but makes it a little more bearable. But as a rule, you know, the rest has all been wound in as I go, so that it looks nice on both sides. I'll still use this sometimes if I lay down on the couch or something. This way kind of covers me across lengthwise, so I can, it makes a good little blanket for nap. But this is one of my favorite projects ever, which, considering it's very repetitive, I tend to get bored easily, so those kinds of projects don't always hold my interest. But I think it's because the challenge of combining the various yarns and seeing how they knit up, and coupled with the sort of soothing, repetitive nature of it, this has become like one of my favorite projects. And when I'm working on it, I tend to sit down with my first cup of tea in the morning and do a square. And then I usually will then pick up the yarn for the next square so that the next one's ready to go. I don't have to think too hard first thing in the morning. So that's that. Very happy with it. And I'm anxious to finish, but I still have tons of scraps left over. I did start a barn raising, do they call it a quilt? Barn raising square blanket, which I've done, can't remember how many squares I've done, maybe 8 or 10. And I don't enjoy it quite as much. I think the squares take longer. I've just had less interest in that, but pardon me, but I will. I'll pick it up again and do that too. It's a great way to use up the larger amounts of scraps. I've been enjoying seeing everybody's crochet blankets. I'm not sure if that's the way I'll go or not, but I'm sure I'll find another way to use them because there's far too many just to leave sitting. And I've enjoyed this blanket so much I'm tempted to just pick up and begin again. This time I might do it with the squares facing, you know, square instead of diamond shaped, because I've liked how those look on other people's too. So maybe that's the solution. And maybe I can convince myself to be just a little less choosy so that I can just reach in the bag and pull out something instead of feeling like I have to have it all planned out before I go. The other day I pulled out my scraps and I laid out my blanket on the kitchen floor, and I spent a while planning the next 4 rows of squares. So I have a trunk here in my craft room that I've laid them all out in order on, and so I just pick, when I'm done with 2, I pick the next 2 colors and keep going. But there are drawbacks to that, because if I don't have the time or the space to lay it all out, the blanket simply doesn't get worked on, and I've really missed it. I'm happy to have picked it up again. It's just a great pleasure. I decided, that's it for my active works in progress. If you look at my project page, you'll see there are a number of projects that have been started, but currently are just not being worked on. So that's what I'm working on these days. I thought I would also feature what I'm going to call a blast from the past, a past finished object. Today I chose an actually not so distant finished object. I began this in September, finished it in October, as part of a knit-along for this book by Carol Feller called Knitting with Rainbows. And it's all about how to knit with gradient yarns, all these different projects that feature gradient yarns. I really love gradient yarns. I think they're beautiful and lots of fun to knit with, and they're great for motivating you to go on to the next stage and the next stage, because you just can't wait to see how they look together. So I see that's catching the light a bit there. So yeah, so Carol had a knit along in her group for this book. I did a pair of socks, and I also did the shawl that I'm about to show you. And I have used this countless times since then. I had a Sweet Georgia Yarns Party of 5 mini skein pack in the English Bay colorway, and I added another color to it, a green, to stretch it to 6 colors. That's what the pattern called for. And then I purchased a skein of silver to go in between. So this is the finished shawl. Can you tell I like these colors? I really enjoyed doing this. These 2 greens, no, this is one green, and I added a new one here, spruce, and then I worked from the colors that came in the pack. It was really fun. I believe she called this a string of pearls pattern that separated the different color sections, and then there was a picot edge. And while I think this is beautiful, it is not something I wear outside the home. It's just not to my taste for to go with my coat or something. It's actually quite large, too big to use as a scarf, which is how I use most of my shawls or shawlettes. But I do often put this around me in the evening when I sit and read in bed, and it's nice and warm. And with our cold weather, I actually will leave it wrapped around me as I tuck in under the covers too. So this has been a much used finished project. I just love it. It was so fun to knit, and I think it's beautiful, and it is cozy and warm and a real pleasure to use. So that's been a great one. I don't know if you're like me, but some things that I knit, I enjoy the process, and then, you know, I really don't use them. So it's nice to find ones that you really do wear, you know, over and over and over again. So I would say that takes care of my knitting, and I thought I would just briefly show you what I've got going with quilting. I was watching the Love Sock Wool podcast about a year ago, and Sarah showed off a quilt she had made from Little House on the Prairie fabrics. And I just knew that not only did I need to make myself a Little House on the Prairie quilt, but I needed to make one for my sister. She and I were avid readers of the Little House on the Prairie books, but also we both took a real interest in Laura Ingalls Wilder, the author, and read a lot of work on the author herself, and learned, you know, how the fiction differed from her real life story, and her relationship she had with her daughter Rose Wilder Lane, who was also an author, and her daughter Rose helped her in the writing process of the Little House books, and there's quite a lot of information and opinion on just how much help she gave, or how much rewriting, etc. she did. But I think it's safe to say Laura had her own voice, and it shines through in the books. And when you compare them to her daughter's writing, it is actually quite different. But there's no doubt that Rose did have an impact on her mother's writing career and encouraged her to carry on with it. And what a treasure it is. I still remember reading, my first book was on the banks of Plum Creek, and I think I was partway through the book and I realized that the character's name and the author's name were the same, and had an inkling that, oh, this is actually a true story. And I've been a lifelong fan. So anyway, my sister turned 50 this year, and I decided that was a great way to celebrate, and I rigged the Christmas draw so that I got her name so I could combine her birthday and Christmas presents. So I made her a Laura Ingalls Wilder quilt, and I had enough material to make enough of the squares to also make one for my daughter. She is also a fan, and I knew she would appreciate the significance of the fabric, and so it was a great pleasure on Christmas Day to watch them both open their quilt together. I don't have pictures of it. If you go onto my profile page on Ravelry and click through to my Flickr account, you can see pictures there. I got the pattern from this wonderful book, Quilt As You Go Made Modern, and I made them variations of the Ballard quilt, which I'll show you. Ballard blocks. So I did one with the kind of tumbling blocks shown, the off-kilter blocks, and then the other I did straight, but I divided the fabrics in half on a triangular thing and matched two different fabrics with a diagonal line through the middle, which I really enjoyed matching up the fabrics. It was fun. So for my own quilt, I have all the blocks made. I just need to sew them together. So I chose the Solstice Parade pattern for that one. Looks like that. And it was a great way to try out my new sewing machine because I quilted all the little areas, all these strips with all sorts of different of the pattern stitches. So it was a great way to just give my machine a try out. Had a lot of fun playing with the colors and with the stitches. So I'll show you a few blocks from those. So here's my stack. I combined the Prairie Flower fabrics with the Scenics and Icons. So I decided to put the Scenics and Icons down the center of each block and then border it with the Prairie Flower patterns. And I don't know if you can see, but I used all sorts of different stitches for all these different parts. Some more decorative than others, as you can see, or more elaborate than others, as you can see. One thing I had a lot of fun with, here I'll show you a few. They're in order, so I have to be careful to keep them that way. Now what I'm going to do when I sew them together, because I'm new at this and because all of these didn't quite match up going that way, they're a little bit off, I'm going to sew a navy, there's a word for it, can't remember what it is, like a little piece of navy fabric to border them, and then that'll actually really set off the fabrics for one thing, and it will make the imperfections a little less noticeable. I'm going to bind it in this fabric here. I have my binding all ready to go, and then the back of the quilt is going to be in this fabric, which is, I just love it. This was one of my very favorite fabrics from the collection, so that'll go in the back. Something else I did, which I had a lot of fun with, see if I can find one here, is periodically I embroidered the name of one of the characters onto the square. So that's Grace, that was one of Laura's sisters. So I have one for Ma and for Pa, Almanzo, her husband, her sister Mary, and Grace and Carrie, and her daughter Rose. And so that was just really fun. They'll just be randomly sprinkled throughout the blanket. So that was really fun. So I guess just remains to be said, those are all my current projects. I suppose I know I really enjoy when podcasters give you a little recap of what's going on in their lives. So I think there's room here for a little bit of that. We've had a very busy Christmas season. We had family for dinner. We take turns in my family. I have 4 sisters. 3 of them live locally, and so the 4 of us take turns hosting Christmas dinner. And we have a large family, so this year there were 25 of us for dinner here. We were really lucky too. My husband's mother and his brother and his wife were also here. They live in Victoria, British Columbia, so most years we don't spend Christmas with them. They tend to do it on their own on the island, and we generally stay here. So it was really nice to have them, and also my mom and my sisters, brothers-in-law, and nieces and nephews. So we had a great time. Kids, grandkids, of course, too. So that was good. We had some people staying with us for a week, so it was a busy week. Lots of visiting, lots of people in and out, and lots of going out, but really nice. Things were made a little bit more difficult by a flood in our basement a week before Christmas. I woke up the Sunday before Christmas to the sound of running water downstairs, and I knew that wasn't a good sign. We'd had very cold weather, and we believe that the hose that connects to the cold water tap in our downstairs bathroom had blown off, and the water was pouring out of there, and we believe that it got frozen. It's on an outside wall, and that's our best guess. The most it would have been going for was about 6 hours, because it wasn't we got to bed very late and it wasn't going when we went to bed. So in the worst areas, it was about 1 inch of water. We got it turned off right away and started mopping up. There were 1 bedroom down there and the laundry area were not affected, but the rest was. So the restoration company's been in and ripped up all the flooring from those affected areas and baseboards, etc. And we'll be getting them replaced. Thankfully, it's covered by insurance. We still have a fairly hefty deductible we have to pay, but you know, we'll end up with new flooring. The heartbreaking part is we just did a lot of replaced all the doors this year in our home and switched out from kind of a oak looking trim to white. So all those baseboards that have come off are all brand new. I've painted the miles and miles of them. So the consolation is I don't have to paint them this time, but it was heartbreaking to see all that work that was just finished a short time ago ripped up and done. On the other hand, we had planned to reconfigure our basement somewhat in the next year or two, and this gives us the opportunity to do that before the new flooring goes in. So, and we would have been replacing the flooring ourselves in this case. A great deal of the cost will be covered. So there's a bright side to everything. Very little in the way of personal possessions were lost, thankfully. Just some, you know, some souvenirs, greeting cards, etc. But our furniture wasn't affected except for a box frame of a mattress, which can be cleaned, and you know, so we lost very little in that way. It was mostly just a really big inconvenience having the blowers in here, the fans going for a couple of weeks. We had a couple days off at Christmas, and we were able to use our family room to house a couple of guests and have it for the overflow for the Christmas holidays. But it is what it is. So this year, we just finished having a construction zone in our house, and now here we go again. But that's life. And in the scheme of things, it could be so much worse. So what do you do? Now that the holidays are over and everyone's gone home, I'm looking forward to the next week or two being a little quieter, and then I've got a lot of activities, some babysitting I'm going to be doing, and we're back into our weekly activities. I curl once a week, sometimes twice if I spare, and we get together with a group of friends on Tuesday nights and play volleyball. I say play volleyball because really we just hit the ball around and have a lot of laughs. So good exercise and a lot of fun. So we're back into to normal life. I'm taking the Christmas tree and decorations down tomorrow. So our house will get back to normal again too in that sense. And as much as I love the holiday season, it is nice to have a routine and a little bit quieter time too. So I guess that's it for today. I've rambled on. Hopefully you enjoy this first podcast. I am not sure how often I'll record. It will depend on life. As I've learned, you can never really predict what's going to happen, and so I just will have to go with the flow, and I'll try and get it out every week or two. We'll see how that goes. So if you have any comments you'd like to make, you can reach me on Ravelry as Knits and Pearls. That's capital K NITSNPURLS. And I look forward to hearing from you. Take care, everyone, and see you soon. Bye.